can just be a discussion.
Perfect, perfect.
I mean,
As I mentioned, I think, yeah, wherever you feel, please sit where you feel more
perfect.
comfortable, wherever you, and move stuff off my desk if you need some
That's
room.
perfect.
So,
Thank you so much.
sure.
All right.
So, interestingly, everyone at the time, back in the 90s, when the first apartment bombings happened, keep in mind, this is now in Moscow, right? It's in the city proper. There were some, Budyonovsk out in Siberia was one of the very first ones of these large apartment buildings from pretty much the 1930s, 20s that suddenly blamed on maybe, was it just bad plumbing? Was it the heating systems, whatever, going out? But immediately the government puts the blame on, no, these are acts of domestic, some kind of terrorism, either domestic or, it's funny because we talk about the Chechens in post-Soviet Russia, it's still domestic because the Chechens are part of the Russian Federation. So, but is this basically a war against the government taking place from within our own country? That doubt was placed kind of in the minds of both the press largely and in the population more specifically, just ongoing through the 90s, was that every time there was any kind of subway bombing, any kind of apartment bombing, either artifacts would be found, and this became one of the most controversial parts of the investigations, was very soon after each of these incidents, public press, so things like everything from the classic press of Pravda, Izvestia, but even the more popular press like Argumenty, Fakti, the papers that everybody actually read, were showing pictures of these fragments of what we're told to be designated to be, oh, these are clearly bombs made, and they've got the markings of the Caucasus, they're what are called grupirovki, these bands of criminals that are down in the Caucasus committing acts of terrorism here in our homeland. That policy, if you will, it's not policy actually at all, but that kind of position prevailed through the war. So the war begins in 1994, really through the late 90s, when Putin runs on his platform in 2000 for president of eliminating the Chechens, basically saying we'll wipe them off the map. And he makes that really crude comment of we're going to track them down to where they live, in the latrines where they hang out, right? He really wanted to make the ethnic terrorism question a flashpoint for every Russian voter, without question. This was part of his idea, but this could be a point that could help him win. And yeah, it's really kind of funny. It resonates now in 2017, really interestingly, because it's very much a let's make Russia, and it wasn't great again, but let's make Russia great as she was, right? This kind of Russia in the past, the Soviet Union was the number one or number two, depending on your position, world power. And look at us now. Our economy's bad. We're not who we used to be. Let's get back on track in the 21st century.
Sure.
So yeah, so the Chechens and the Chechen question became really one of Putin's monikers. He, no question, I loved your comment at the very beginning, was, did this give him a way, in a sense, to solidify an agenda? I would take it even one step further. I mean, he used the apartment bombings, the subway bombings, anything he could tie to domestic terrorism as a way, an excuse, if you will, to invoke a kind of War Powers Act. That my dear Russian people, you're going to give me the tools to be able to do, as your president, anything that needs to be done, right, to take care of this terrorism. And what it allowed him to do was increase the size of the armed forces. He lowered the drafting age on the young end and raised it on the high end, so that it went from, if I'm remembering at the beginning of the Chechen War, it was 18 to 24, and he lowered it down. At its lowest point, it was 16. That was very brief. It was down to 17, up to 39. So anyone between the ages of 17 and 39 was eligible for the Russian draft for a period in the early 2000s, just to handle this immediate, as he would call it, emergency situation. Back, his KGB training did pay off here, because there's an abbreviation, this kind of ЧП, this immediate need for emergency proceedings to take place, that we need to do something that's going to get worse. So it was a long-winded way of saying,
No.
you're right.
No,
You're
you're-
absolutely right. He did use or abuse the
Sure.
situation in Chechnya to really put himself in a position of power. Yeah.
I've got a question. How did what were the effects of 9/11, and how did that change international support, domestic support? Did that give him? I guess the world realized the threat that terrorism had on an international scale, and what effect did that have on Putin, giving him, I guess, credibility in what he was doing in Chechnya
Yeah.
for a campaign that might not have been going so well?
Absolutely. So it's interesting. It was, I think, well reported at the time. I mean, for your generation now, this is pretty much ancient history already. But when 9/11 happened, the first international call, the first person to respond, as it were, of world leaders was Putin to George W. Bush. And this is highly reported. I obviously don't know the exact content of the conversation. The reported content of the conversation was Putin contacts Bush almost immediately after 9/11 is reported internationally and says, I'm kind of summarizing here, let's talk. I know where they're from. That's almost a quotation. I know where this group, again, where they're from. I know what's going on here. Let's talk about this. Bush agrees, but that obviously was not going to be his first order of business, was to look at this as an international question for him, and again, for good reason. I think he wanted to keep this looking at, what he began to call then the war on terror as a local U.S. crisis at the moment. What Putin had in mind, now I'm editorializing here, but what I think Putin had in mind, very much so, was the connection between the training camps that were indeed the exact same camps being used to train Chechen terrorist rebels in Afghanistan, were the ones that trained the majority of the 9/11 bombers. They were not, as we all knew this, of course, when we went into Iraq and so forth. These were not Iraqis. These were not the terrorists that were being named as the global terrorists. These actually were some of our own seemingly allies, the Saudis, right? I mean, most notoriously Bin Laden, right? Of Saudi Arabia, supposedly our ally, was where so many of these guys were from. And Putin had information, and I have no doubt that he has this information, that those same training camps in the late 90s and early 2000s that trained Chechens for their tactics were also the ones who trained Saudis, Turks, whomever was engaging in these kind of activities for the kind of things he was doing. And wanted, I think, if I want to really play kind of a devil's advocate here as to why would Putin offer this hand to Bush so early on. No question that if he could have succeeded, ultimately he does, Putin succeed in bringing Bush into the global war on terror, that indeed solidifies Putin's status as having a legitimate war, a terror war on his own soil, the same way now that the United States does. The more that after 9/11, the more that we looked at international terrorism as part and parcel of what was happening domestically in the U.S., the more we understood what Putin was dealing with. So there's a sympathetic way of looking at the situation at the time as well, which is Putin also was sort of saying, I've been dealing with this for, since I was prime minister of Russia under Yeltsin. I've been seeing what's going on in Chechnya all along. It's just now hitting the U.S. mainland.
Mm.
Yeah.
Very interesting. And what bills specifically did Putin? I know he implemented the War Powers Act, but were there any bills in particular? As a group, we struggled to find online specifically what he enacted. Was it just vague consolidation of power?
So War Powers Act was invoked 3 times that I'm remembering offhand, and I could look to see more specifically. What he's been very, I think, good at doing as a president of his kind. I mean, I'm not as quick to call him he isn't simply to be able to put a simple moniker on him like he's a fascist, he's a nationalist, he's we want to do this. I mean, we in the West like to be able to say, oh, he's that kind of man / president, leader, and it's not. He's complicated. Putin's a complicated leader. Actually, he's not simple. Everyone who writes on him, most recently Karen DeWishen in her book Kleptocracy, he's hard to put a single label, moniker on. Ultimately, she calls him a kleptocrat, which I think is probably closest because there are so many parts to that name. So all that said, what does he do actually? He's very good at consolidating his agenda into seemingly, I can't quite say innocuous, but less harmful kinds of acts. So where everyone would notice if he did invoke a War Powers Act, everyone would notice if he said, I'm going to suspend the following freedoms in the name of a war on terror. People would react. People would say something. You can't do this. You cannot do this. It's against our Constitution. What he is able to do, though, is to sort of take specific groups that, and again, these are part of his agenda as well, that he will enact in the name of our security, our safety. So it's not calling it War Powers Act, but rather безопасность, the greater word Russia uses for simple our safety, our security, right? Things like laws against posting hate literature, hate mail, hate anything on the web, anything that's posted in the press. That is what he would call hate speech. So under that, what does he include? Terrorism, obviously. So if you post something that says, death to the Russian people, you can be arrested. But he used that language, you see, not only to keep his agenda, his anti-terrorism agenda. Yes, please, that's fine. To keep his anti-terrorism agenda going. Sure. But he's also simultaneously, he was able to enact laws against, say, homosexuals, against protesters of the Chechen War, those who were protesting people like Nemtsov, for example, whom ultimately he or someone close to him has assassinated. He's very good in this kind of, what I was kind of call these peripheral ways of enacting a very important piece of legislation, which is why you probably you can't just go online and say, Putin invoking war powers against terrorism, because it's probably embedded in some other piece of legislation that he has the Duma put in. And it's not unusual, by the way. It's not as though we're so squeaky clean. We do this same kind of what we call pork barreling all the time, of putting out one piece of major legislation and tacking on all kinds of other bits of legislation to it to be enacted. I mean, the most current one is things like immigration laws being tucked into the current tax plan. So I mean, we do this in the U.S. all the time under both administrations, by the way, Democratic and Republican. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for your time.
Not at all. I love